What set us up for the public markets was in 2018, California became a for-profit cannabis industry. And, at that time, it was at the same time the Canadian public markets basically opened up to U.S. companies. And it was the place that made the most sense to go to get growth capital. We are expecting to see a lot of growth in California in 2018, 2019. It didn't quite turn out that way. But the purpose of going public was to get the growth capital that we needed to stay up as the market expanded.
And so why didn't it happen in 2018 and 19?
Because of the way that California went about legalizing cannabis. And let this be a cautionary tale to all of my friends in Australia.
Please.
The temptation is to accept legalization on almost any terms because we're being arrested and people are going to jail and having their lives destroyed. Be very careful. Do not give in to that temptation. In California, two things happened which have really crippled the industry here. One, the industry was overtaxed. We in the old system prior to 2018, the maximum tax rate was about 10%, and it was lower than that in some parts of the state. Post 2018, it's now gone to over 40% everywhere in the state. And at the same time, the state imposed a lot of very heavy requirements for growers and manufacturers to enter from the underground market into the legal market. Well, I mean, the basic reason that we ended up on the Canadian Stock Exchange is because we were very, very successful at building a cannabis business. And so within our first year, we were at $7 million a year in annual revenue. By the end of our third year, we were at $20 million of annual revenue. And we continued growing from there. And we're over $60 million a year in revenue now. So, that the basic reason is that we became very good at providing the kind of cannabis to cannabis consumers that they want. There were a lot of legal changes that needed to happen along the way. And, we almost didn't make it to those legal changes. By law, until 2018, we were a nonprofit organization. And so you couldn't go public. We were a nonprofit. And in 2011, the 4 U.S. attorneys, federal attorneys in the state of California, decided that they were going to close down California's cannabis industry. I think they hoped to do that before Colorado and other states passed adult use, which was getting ready to happen in 2012. It was sort of the last stand of the prohibitionist. And they used two tactics. One, they applied tax laws to us that didn't apply to anybody else and tried to basically tax us out of existence. And they tried to seize the properties that we were located in. And so another reason that we became very well known was I refused to knuckle under to those attempts, and we fought them both. And eventually we won in the case of the property seizure. So what set us up for the public markets was in 2018, California became a for-profit cannabis industry. And, at that time, it was at the same time the Canadian public markets basically opened up to U.S. companies. And it was the place that made the most sense to go to get growth capital. We are expecting to see a lot of growth in California in 2018, 2019. It didn't quite turn out that way. But the purpose of going public was to get the growth capital that we needed to stay up as the market expanded.
And so why didn't it happen in 2018 and 19?
Because of the way that California went about legalizing cannabis. And let this be a cautionary tale to all of my friends in Australia.
Please.
The temptation is to accept legalization on almost any terms because we're being arrested and people are going to jail and having their lives destroyed. Be very careful. Do not give in to that temptation. In California, two things happened which have really crippled the industry here. One, the industry was overtaxed. We in the old system prior to 2018, the maximum tax rate was about 10%, and it was lower than that in some parts of the state. Post 2018, it's now gone to over 40% everywhere in the state. And at the same time, the state imposed a lot of very heavy requirements for growers and manufacturers to enter from the underground market into the legal market. And it basically costs hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, to set yourself up for the kind of operation that you need in order to be licensed. And so two things happened. On January 1st, 2018, you had cannabis consumers coming into dispensaries where they used to pay 10% tax, and they're getting charged 40 or 45% tax. So they're running out of the dispensaries. Their hair's on fire. They've got sticker shock. They're going, what's going on?
Yeah. And
they run right out into the hands of all of the growers and manufacturers who were unable to get licensed by the state because of the over rigorous requirements. So basically, overtaxation and overregulation have largely strangled the legalization baby in its cradle in California. I think that we'll come out of that eventually. It's, we are still the largest legal cannabis market in the world today.
Yeah.
But it's really been slowed down, and the full potential of it hasn't been achieved yet.
So why are there some companies that are on the stock market, like the Green Thumb Industries, for example, which I think its market cap's around $7 billion? How does it get such a big valuation?
Well, there are some companies that have been really, really successful at raising money, acquiring licenses, and focusing on states that have a limited number of licenses. So, in a lot of the states that you see the multi-state operators focusing on, they tend to focus on states, A, that don't have an underground market that they have to compete with, and B, that have a limited number of licenses. And I think that that's been a successful strategy thus far for a lot of them. But, eventually businesses have to compete on the basis of their own strengths, not on the basis of differences in licensing and regulation. One day, there will be a more or less free market for cannabis in the United States and around the world. And I think that, that the challenge for companies that have leaned on licensing advantages is going to be using that lead time to really build themselves into companies that can truly compete in a free market.
So it's been legalized, but it's more been legalized for corporates that have the big dollars to come in and to basically own the limited licensing that's available. And so the general entrepreneur will kind of have a hard time to launch a business in the current environment. Is that like a fair statement to say?
Yeah. Let me give you a personal
Please.
Experience there. So, my organization competed in Nevada unsuccessfully. And at that time, I thought that we were amongst the most adept people at winning licenses. And we put together a license application that we had 6 great big boxes of documents, and it took 2 people with dollies to wheel all of those boxes into the office to submit the applications. Well, we knew we were in trouble when we saw van loads of documents pulling up that were sent there by some of the biggest law firms in the state. And what's happened is that when you have a limited number of licenses that are going to be awarded, and they are generally awarded on the basis of who has the most meritorious application, you have large companies who spend a great deal of money to put together the most meritorious application. And in some cases, that means just the application itself, but also if you have the ability to lock up properties, if you have the ability to put together a very impressive board of directors and an advisory board, if you have the ability to put together a compliance department that features former DEA officials, if you can put together a board of directors that features a former Speaker of the House of the U.S. House of Representatives, generally you are more able to get through that licensing process than people who have been underground cannabis growers for the past 20 years and don't have that kind of track record to show to regulators.
Sounds like some big challenges there. How did you persist through what I imagine would have seemed like insurmountable challenges, like, across the last 2, 3, 4 decades?
I just don't quit.
You just don't quit?
I just don't quit. I mean, there's one sure way to lose, and that's stopping. And I was just never willing to do that. And how, I don't know. I mean, there were times that was very, very difficult, Alex, in the 1980s and the 1990s. These commercials would come on television with like a fried egg on a griddle and talking about how this is your brain on drugs. And they were very much including cannabis in there. And we were really made to feel like we were pariahs. There were times when I didn't have a clue whether we were ever going to be successful. But I knew that for me, I knew the truth about this plant. I knew the potential about this plant. I knew that this plant has the ability to save this planet. And I wasn't willing to give up that possibility, that struggle. It was something that I was called to do. And I felt like I had to execute on that.
Sounds like it's something that you're extremely passionate about, and we'll come back to that in shortly. But just back to business quickly. At the point that it became for profit, back in 2018, aside from the manufacturing and the dispensaries, were there any other types of businesses that were launched at the time that became successful?
Well, there are a lot of various different kinds of cannabis businesses, both licensed and unlicensed, that have developed over the years. Mm-hmm. On the licensed side, I would say that the licensing itself did not give birth to any new product categories. In fact, to some degree, the process of licensing dampens innovation and slows innovation down. And I'm not sure that that's true. But I'm not sure that it's really given birth to any of the new and most dynamic areas of cannabis. But so I'll talk about one of the most interesting innovations that's happened here recently. There's an Israeli company that's just opened a campus in California, and they're using CRISPR technology to work with the cannabis plant. And
what's that?
It's basically gene editing technology. So it's the same technology that's used to create genetically modified organisms. Mm-hmm. And that technology can be used in one of two ways. It can be either be used as a laboratory to use natural breeding techniques and enhance natural breeding techniques and move them along much more quickly, or to actually create genetically modified organisms. I'm not sure what the approach of this company is, and I'm not going to mention their name anyhow. Yeah. But it's very interesting that they're using this technology. Now, what's also interesting is what they're trying to do with it. They want to produce a completely THC-free genetic variety of cannabis. And that they say that they want to do this in order to make sure that industrial hemp crops don't run hot. I think there's better solutions to doing that. I'm very suspicious of genetics that try to get rid of THC entirely, because I know it to be one of the most valuable components in the cannabis plant. And it's really research that's being driven more by prohibition and the demands of prohibition than the plant. I'd rather see them working to develop varietals of cannabis that are specifically targeted at specific medical conditions, mm-hmm. or varietals of cannabis that will be more resistant to specific different types of pests or diseases. So I think that but there's what I say to anybody who's looking at the cannabis industry and thinking about the scope of it is this: whatever it is that you already do, whatever it is that you're passionate about, you will be able to find a place to do that in the world of cannabis, because cannabis has been illegal since the birth of modern business technology and practices. So whatever it is that you do in business, if you do software, if you do marketing, if you do formulation, if you do compliance, if you do investment, it doesn't matter. There's plenty of room for you to take those skills into the world of cannabis, because it's a blank slate. We need to figure out how to do all of these things with cannabis now.
There's some commentary out there that that all the money in legal cannabis industry across, say, California, and the US at the moment has already been made. It's too hard to break in right now. Is that a true statement or not?
No, it's absolutely not true, because the industry is just in the beginning phases of being built out here. Important to remember that we still have, I think the current count is around 15 adult use states and around 30 states that have medical cannabis laws. Mm-hmm. We will anticipate eventually that all of the states are going to have adult use laws, and so just building out the whole infrastructure of that business, the entire supply chain, is going to be a huge job, and it's going to have massive opportunities in front of us. And I think that lots of times people fail to understand the true magnitude of what cannabis is and what it can become. And really, if you take a look at what's happened with the disruption factor in legal cannabis markets, what we found is the cannabis has already very significantly disrupted alcohol by a factor of 15 to 25%. You see a drop in alcohol sales in every legal cannabis state. Same thing with pharmaceuticals. You see a market drop in pharmaceutical and prescription writing, especially of opioids and painkillers and tranquilizers. So you're seeing a very significant disruption there as well. We're just beginning to see the kind of market disruption that's going to happen as hemp is increasingly used as a raw material too. Keeping in mind that anything right now that's made out of petroleum or a tree or cotton or a number of other raw materials can instead be made out of hemp, and in a more cost-effective and eco-friendly way. We're really just looking at the beginning of what this is growing into. I believe by dollar volume, maybe not in my lifetime, but probably in your lifetime, cannabis is going to be the most valuable product on the planet.